Hi guys, welcome to another BigLipz podcast. This is episode 14. My name's Kath Maurice and with me is the lovely Sam Macaulay-Blair. We are two kind of former and current film students, just trying to do something a bit kind of creative or whatever during lockdown when we're not allowed out of the house. I mean, we are now, but you know, Sam moved to Liverpool, so here we are. Yeah, so basically we just pick a different topic every couple of weeks and then discuss it. This time we've gone down a slightly different route. So for this podcast, we're going to be talking about what makes horror movies scary. So this is basically going to be a bit more technical than normal. Like we're going to talk about, instead of doing our own kind of personal choices, we're going to talk about different kind of filmmaking techniques and elements that are used within horror to make them scary and how that works, examples of that and whatnot. So we're just going to jump right in, and Sam's going to start with what I would argue is probably one of the most important, no pressure Sam, one of the most important elements of horror movies, and that is sound. So Sam, fire away.
Thank you. Lovely introduction. Yeah, no, as you say, like sound probably is arguably the most important aspect. It's one of the most important aspects of filmmaking in general. I think like I was watching a filmmaking video a few weeks ago, and they talked in that about the fact that if you're watching something on like Netflix, say, like any sort of streaming service, the thing you'll notice is like they will always, you know, if the internet connection starts to drop, whatever, they will immediately like sacrifice the visual quality. You know, you'll suddenly be watching things with a lot of pixels, but they'll maintain that same like sort of consistent audio, because you can forgive like a bit of a you know, some rough picture. You can forgive some like you know, some low definition images, or at least a bit like, you know, a period of like low definition, but you're going to be a lot less forgiving if the sound suddenly gets really tinny, if you suddenly can hear what they're saying but suddenly out of sync. You're just all you're going to notice, whereas like you can kind of get past when like the picture's a bit bad. So yeah, like especially with horror, which can be quite minimalist and also quite experimental, sound design is really, really important. So I've got like a few sort of like examples that again, you know, pretty much talk about every single horror on this one. I think you really sort of like struggle to find a horror that doesn't have good sound design, because it needs to if it's going to succeed really. But to go for maybe like well, it's a very, very popular film and it will probably be discussed within other categories here, but one that I would like to mention is A Nightmare on Elm Street, for the sound in that, because I think does a really good job of sort of narratively weaving sound elements in. You have obviously the sound of like Krueger's claws like screeching down the wall on like various surfaces. You have the nursery rhyme, which is really creepy. You know, the one that he's coming for you. I think they did a really, really good job. Even the theme is like peak 80s and absolutely brilliant. I think A Nightmare on Elm Street is a classic and uses sound very much to its advantage. So that's again a very popular choice. More contemporary, but again equally as popular choice would be Hereditary. There's the wee sort of clicking sound. Like
that's really important in that movie. Yeah, that's
exactly. And yeah, I guess just remember, like again, the last time I watched it, I was looking at like a lot of the behind the scenes for one of the videos we made actually for this channel. Was watching a lot of the behind the scenes stuff on that, and they talk a lot about like Ari Aster talked a lot about like really being very mindful of that when you're sort of creating the story and then like using it and like obviously like deliberately layering it so you sort of understood the meaning and then like managing to sort of creep you out with it. Top of that, it also just has like a really creepy score. I think there's like a clarinet sort of like blast that plays throughout like specific points. I only know it's a clarinet because again you mentioned it. Even though I used to play the clarinet briefly, never. That's
amazing. I love to think that your ears are so fine-tuned that you're like, oh yes, you can tell the difference between all the different like wind instruments.
It's just clarinets. Just have a really good ear for clarinets, nothing else. Right. Can't tell pianos from guitars, but if it's clarinet,
that's a clarinet.
Yeah, exactly.
Pick it out of an orchestra.
Exactly. Yeah, that was a tune. So yeah, Hereditary is probably my second obvious example. Another one I want to quickly mention, which again we talked about in the podcast before, in a very different capacity, is the Evil Dead, the new one, the reboot, or remake, or whatever it was, because I think it's also kind of a continuation, recontinuing. That had, do you remember there was like a part of the soundtrack of that movie? Because I saw the movie when it came out in the cinemas. I hadn't seen any of the Evil Dead stuff, so I didn't really know anything about it. And I remember like enjoying it well enough, but like it didn't, over the years I've just kind of forgotten most of it. But I do remember walking away from it, and I remember there was like one specific part of like the score, the soundtrack, and it just sort of sticking with me. And it was almost like a sort of like wailing like sound that's been used in the soundtrack. And again, I was actually watching a video today on horror movies, and obviously like the sort of Foley and their sound design and all the sort of process behind that. And that one talked a lot about The Invisible Man, the movie that came out last year, and how clever that movie is with the way like it sort of like will build sort of sound, and they'll have like sort of little footsteps, and the Foley artist is basically talking a lot about how you like delicate you need to be in terms of like, obviously there's a scene where she's in the attic and the Invisible Man's like on a ladder, but they don't really want to spoil that he's on the ladder, but at the same time they want that information to be like subtly implanted in your brain. So you got like Foley, you obviously got the sound of like him on a ladder, but he managed to like do it to just the right degree that you pick up that that's what it is, but you won't really be able to recognize that's what it is until obviously
until you kind of see the aftermath of it.
Exactly. So it's basically using the sound design in the same way that you would use like filmmaking almost, where you would like, or in writing, where you like layer little things in. And in that again, he talks about the fact that he used I don't even know if it's the soundtrack or just the general sound design, but they use like wind chimes quite a lot, and then kind of like distort them and stuff, because again it's just another thing that it just really like it displaces you almost, like you feel like, why am I hearing wind chimes when I can't see wind chimes? But again, it's like soft enough that you don't really like pick up on it as much. It's just something that kind of like throws you off a little bit.
That's funny, because I read somewhere, that when like sometimes because like sometimes if you hear things and we can't see it, it makes us like even more afraid, especially if we don't, like you're saying, if we can't quite place what it is. There's almost a familiarity, but then it's disconcerting because you can't think what it is, and then it just makes it even scarier.
Exactly. And especially wind chimes as well, which are typically quite soothing, quite nice in a situation where like things are maybe a bit not nice, a bit tense. And I guess you become, that was another thing that was mentioned as well, is that they mentioned that like when you are designed as like a sort of like living being that's designed to like go out and survive in the wild, if you hear a sound that's like a bit unnatural, a bit like off, then you do immediately like prick up, and you suddenly become very alert, and you're suddenly very, very much like listening attentively, and that's like the wind chimes then become like quite a sinister thing. And then obviously lastly, I can't possibly go without mentioning A Quiet Place.
Of course.
is like the whole movie is just like sound design. Because obviously like if anyone has ever seen that in a cinema, you know exactly what it's like, the suspense and how much everyone in the cinema adheres to the rules of the movie, where you just make as little noise as possible. You get so like transfixed by the silence. That's again a really good example of minimalism as well, and showing like how you can really play with sound, and how you like less can be more, how you don't necessarily have to do that much, but when you like, if you do that, if you pull everything away, and then you obviously like you really focus on like the smaller sounds, it then makes you like again really alert, but then you can like have some really big like jump moments. You can have some really, really good like effective moments when you really react to like loud sounds, because you've like you've been conditioned almost to be scared of them yourself. I feel like I've talked more than enough.
No, that was A Quiet Place is such a good choice as well, because it's not, I wouldn't say it was full of jump scares, but it uses them so well, like you were saying, because it builds up this kind of silence the entire way through. And then it's funny because even when it's not jump scares, even when there's characters or things in the movie making noise, you get nervous because you know that something horrible is going to happen, because they're so conscious about being quiet. That's good. No, that was really interesting. I think it's funny as well, I wanted to mention like horror movies, more so in maybe like the 80s kind of like slasher movies, they always had like where the villain had their own kind of like score, which is funny because so if it cuts to a shot like from through some bushes or something, it'll have that villain score. Or when it's like in Halloween when Michael's following people, it's like his little score that's playing, and then that again just kind of creates associations with like scary things. I just think that's so funny.
You get conditioned to be scared of like a piece of music, basically.
Yeah, like the Jaws theme, that's creepy, and it's just like 2 notes of music. And is it creepy because the music's creepy, or is it creepy because we're associating it with a giant shark that's eating people?
Exactly. I think in that's such a beautiful example of where it's both, where the music itself builds like wonderfully. It is like a suspense piece, but at the same time, like it's now so, because like again, like sharks can be very scary, but they can also be not that scary, especially like when you're watching them from a cinema grounded on land, miles away from the ocean. So yeah, using like sound in that example, is a very, very effective tool to actually like get people to believe in the sort of suspense of the moment. So I like Jaws as an example.
Jaws is a perfect example for everything. That's all I'm going to say. I stopped short of wearing my Jaws top because it was the only kind of like horror top that I had, but I thought I've done it before.
It's overplayed.
Exactly. So yeah, no, that was really interesting. We're going to move now into framing, which I kind of stumbled across this when I was doing research, when I was doing a short horror film, just to try and figure out what's the best way to make it scary. And one thing that I read about was horror movies' use of negative space. So negative space is like everything around me and you just now. Everything that's basically not the subject is negative space. And I think horror movies have such a good opportunity for to utilize it. And I think one that does it really well is the movie It Follows. There's a lot of kind of wider shots where there's a lot of negative space in the background, and obviously the whole movie's about what's in the background. And I think that does it really well because it does it kind of from the get-go. So you know almost to look out for things, you know what the story is, they explain it pretty well. So especially when there's a lot of people in the background, for especially It Follows, when there's a lot of people in the background, you're like, is it them? Is it that wee old woman? Is it that guy?
Yeah, and they use a lot of wide lenses, don't they? Like you get a lot of. I remember like whenever I think of that movie, I just think of these shots where like it just stretches on, and you get like you get obviously like you said the subjects, and then there's so much negative space that you just. And you're so like conditioned to be watching the subject, but in that movie you're just like your eyes are constantly darting about. Like.
Yeah, exactly. No, so I thought that was really interesting, and I think as well, a lot of the time you're kind of like the angles. This is kind of similar to the way that we are being shot, where we are facing forward, and then the camera's kind of shooting behind us, which makes it even scarier. Like, so there's good times for like things to just come out of the darkness. And one example I always think of, well, there's two. One of them is also It Follows, when the big, when I think they just call him the tall man, when he like appears out the bedroom doorway.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's scary AF.
Yeah, and then, he is the tall man indeed.
Yeah, and then the other one I always think is really cool is again Halloween, when Laurie's just kind of standing there and she's kind of to this side of the frame, and there's a lot of darkness on this side, and then suddenly just out of the darkness comes Michael's face.
Yeah.
And it's just so scary because before that, that's like a little respite moment where you think she's gone away, she's going to wee breather, and then he just appears from nowhere.
So perfect as well with like the white mask as well. It's such like an immediate like notice it straight away.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, I was reading about negative space and how it kind of can serve to like isolate the person, especially when in something like It Follows, where it's such a wide screen, which makes the subject even smaller. And there's nothing scarier than horror than isolation, because that's a tried and tested trope.
Exactly.
And then another thing I wanted to talk about in terms of framing is the opposite, where it's really, really tight framing, so like close-ups of people's faces. I think horror movies use that quite a lot, and I think I think it's interesting. I think it's really funny that they can use both for the same result, kind of thing. Obviously, a good example of that is one of your favorite movies, The Shining, and Jack Nicholson when he's coming through the door.
That's the first thing I thought of when you said like clips as well in horror. Mine is straight to The Shining.
It's so funny as well because it's a weird angle when you think about it, because if this is his face here through the door, Wendy's over here.
Yeah.
So we've got like a weird, the camera's like placed in a weird place.
Yeah, it's so misaligned.
Yeah, but it's very effective, especially because The Shining is so good at building tension, and it does it the whole way through. And this is kind of like the climax, so that kind of really tight shot on his face, which is obviously infamous, it just makes it even scarier as well, because there's nowhere else that your eyes can look. You're forced to come to grips with this, and like you've got no place to hide. Also there's this shot as well, I think it's from The Evil Dead that you were talking about, where it's like a super tight shot of the girl, and she's like, oh yes, she's been through it obviously, and she's turning back and she's screaming. And I thought when I was looking up, when I was doing research for the sound bit, it had said that basically the sound of screaming elicits like a fight or flight response in people. So I thought that was funny, like if that's combined with with all you can see is her screaming face, that's just going to make it 10 times worse. And it is because exactly. And when you think of movies, like sometimes there is moments, I remember when I watched The Shining for the first time, I was at uni and there was like a group of us watching it, and there was a guy there, and there's one point when it's Danny and he's having one of those little moments, and the camera like really zooms into his face, and he's just making this horrified face, and one of the guys that we were watching it with, he just started screaming. And it was so funny because he'd been so calm the whole way through, and there was the whole women in the bath scene, which is probably my least favorite one, but like the scariest bit for me. But no, it was this close up of this little boy's face that made him start screaming.
That's what done it.
Exactly. Another example of a small child screaming is in the Babadook.
Yes. Yeah,
and
fantastic.
It's amazing, and that little boy does such a good job because he's already quite creepy, just in like him going about his life as a little boy. So the close up as well, it's when they're in the car and she can't see anything, and it helps as well, I think, to kind of it helps with you to sympathize with the mum, because you kind of experience what she's dealing with. Like he's screaming and we don't know why, she's confused, and the little boy doesn't seem to really know why he's screaming, and the kind of close up of his face just exaggerates that basically. But no, that's what all I've got to say about that.
Fair. No, I like your choices very much. I like as well that you went the two opposite routes basically, with like negative space and then the opposite, like close-ups. Obviously stellar picks. The ones that I'd kind of thought of, I had like a mix of different ones. The Shining was obviously one that was listed. I mean, Kubrick and framing anyway, like he's got so many incredible shots. I was thinking this isn't maybe so much to do with like the scare factor, although I guess this isn't so much to do with the scare factor as it is just like a really cool thing that I think I might have talked about in this podcast before, with like the detail that I remember reading like years ago, and it's when I started to like really love The Shining, because I started to realize just how much was packed into it. The whole thing of like, obviously there's a whole question of like, or there is, at least for part of it, the whole question of like, is Jack just insane, or are they actually ghosts? And apparently every single time that Jack Nicholson's obviously talking to Jack Torrance is talking to like a ghost, apparently there's always like a mirror behind them. And
I do remember you telling me that. That's so interesting. Yeah.
Always like looking in a mirror, and again, like the way that it's framed is you don't ever pick up on it, but when you know to look for it, you can see it. Yeah. And again, I just think one of the most like genius things a filmmaker's ever done.
Yeah, that's just like masterful as well, because if someone not as capable had done that, it would just look like a terrible kind of like
exactly.
student film almost. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Or there'd be
Not
like
to
a
hate
really
on
obvious.
student films, but
They're terrible, a lot of them.
yeah.
Yeah, or there'd be like a really like hammy, obvious like, oh, here's the reveal, and then it would like cut back to all the times, and it would show you him looking in the mirror. But the
Or
fact that
worse,
it's
it
just
would like if he walked away from the mirror, it would like linger on the mirror.
exactly. Whereas yeah, like just having it in there as a detail that you can watch the movie 100 times and never pick up on is one of like the best things. Another one that obviously I just talked about it, but The Invisible Man also has some incredible framing. Does such a good job of like obviously with it really just being like the way they do The Invisible Man is you just don't see him at all. Occasionally like things will move. And obviously like he's the culprit. But it's such a good job of like building suspense where you're literally just seeing nothing. But you're constantly like fixated because of that. You don't have anything to like latch onto, and you know there's something there because like the camera will be placed in a really weird way where like there's a lot of negative space, and the only subject is like quite far to the side of the frame. So then you're scanning about thinking that, okay, well, I'm supposed to be looking at something here. There's something I'm supposed to notice, but what is it? So that was again another shout out to The Invisible Man because it does a lot right.
It does. I feel like it's criminally underrated.
I agree.
Yeah, Elizabeth Moss I really like Elizabeth Moss. She's great in that. But yeah, before I go off on a tangent about Elizabeth Moss, next topic is lighting. And this, I think, will be super fun for you to discuss because I know on a film set I hate dealing with lighting. Because when lighting's bad, it's really bad. But yeah, so I think obviously horror is a really funny one to talk about because there's such like this kind of association with just like horrors are really dark because the dark is scary. So I'm interested to see what you've come up with.
Yeah, well, I've tried to go for like again. I've got like a lot written down for this one, and I've tried to kind of go in very different directions with all of them. So I'll try not to talk too much about each, just so that I'm not rambling for hours. But the first one I want to talk about is the oldest example on the list, which is Nosferatu, and obviously it being German expressionistic. They use a lot of like harsh lighting and shadows. That's really where a lot of like horror imagery comes from is that like you have that creepy like silhouette of Nosferatu stalking about, and it's just like one of them was like it's so like such a simple trick, but it's such an effective one nonetheless. To sort of build on that, you then have like Psycho, obviously, as another one where in particular when it comes to the shower scene, obviously the backlighting to conceal the identity of, spoiler alert, Norman Bates.
Yeah, I mean the movie's only what
70
like,
years old? Yeah, 60, 70 years old.
You've had your chance.
Yeah, exactly. Plus we've talked about it before anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, I like the fact that they again used in horror a lot where they use like backlighting so that there is a silhouette framed basically, and you can't see who they are. Again, going off of like that sort of extreme lighting, you have The Lighthouse, a more sort of contemporary example where that movie is that's another one that works for sound design as well because there's some beautiful sound design in that, but they also have like really, really like striking, deliberately like framed like an older aspect ratio, like a smaller aspect ratio. You have like really sort of harsh, like high contrast lighting. And it just makes like, it's one of those movies that I feel like I can never watch any behind the scenes stuff for because I don't ever want to see any of that in color. Like it's so well suited to the black and white and it adds so much that it's pretty much a perfect fit. On the topic of Robert Eggers, another one that I wanted to talk about was The Witch, for the fact that they used natural lighting for that movie. So that's I guess an example of like almost like subverting it, where they didn't really use any lighting at all. They just tried to make it with it being like it being set in the sort of wilderness effectively, and it just being like this really like old Anglian family out sort of surviving, and they're sort of like living. Their only sources of light are really candles. Again, it really like you suddenly are putting a lot of stock in those little flames. You suddenly have a lot of value in them. But
because that's funny because there's that scene where they're all kind of around the like the dining table and there's just candles in the middle and it's like pitch black around them. Like I'd love to have seen, do you know how sometimes like when obviously because you use like different camera tricks and stuff, it looks like people are further away. I wonder if they were all just like squeezed around this candle, like they were all like that far apart.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it'd be interesting to see what lens they used to see if there was any difference in like proportion. But yeah, no, I really rate the Witch, and the only natural lighting gives it a really sort of like bleak feel, really sort of like washed out. Like there's not, again, you don't have any like artificial like colorful lights or anything going on. Again, another like very obvious example just for like that one really iconic shot is The Exorcist, where obviously like the priest arrives and he's just like in the fog,
of course, yeah.
The house before him. Yeah, exactly. Can't not mention that one.
Yeah.
And then one that I haven't actually seen, but I've always kind of seen like images and stuff of, and was mentioned again when I was doing research, came up a lot, is it was the 70s film Suspiria. And apparently there's a lot of like colors and stuff like that go on in the movie. I think the director made a very conscious effort to go the other way, and try and make it like, to try and sort of like actually have like loads of vibrant colors and have that be the unsettling thing, which Kubrick did a bit of with like Clockwork Orange, just to give Kubrick some more love. Apparently they also used a lot of mirrors with their lighting in Suspiria, to try and give it almost like a sort of like almost give the light a bit of movement, a sort of like reflective quality that just unsettled a little bit. And then sort of lastly, again, I feel like have to mention Midsummer, which we've talked about.
Midsummer's in my notes as well, funnily enough.
Sorry. But yeah, again, it does like Suspiria just goes the complete opposite way and just goes like bright as can possibly be, like uncomfortably bright. And then like builds horror in its own like clever way, especially after having like such a dark intro as well, so you really feel the brightness when they're like in Sweden. But yeah, once again, I'll stop talking.
No, Midsummer's such a good choice as well, because like when you think about horror movies, like I was saying, you think about the dark, and I think as well, like when I was young, I didn't really like horror movies very much, so when I was forced to watch them, the minute it got to any bit that had any kind of light or sunshine, I would relax a wee bit, because I was like, phew, we're getting a wee bit of rest here. And then once it starts to go back into darkness, that's when I can start getting tense again. But Midsummer did exactly the opposite. Like you were saying, it started dark and then it got really bright, and that was just so interesting. I think it was really well done as well.
I agree.
I think as well, one thing I wanted to mention was like horror movies just have like uplighting, because I was reading that it like distorts people's faces, and that freaks us out because they don't look like people, but they kind of do.
Yeah, uncanny valley basically.
Yeah, exactly. So we can almost recognize it as a face, but the distortion kind of like freaks us out because we don't know, is it dangerous, stuff like that. So I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, no, thank you for that, Sam. Very interesting choices. Another thing I wanted to talk about was like shot length and long takes in horror movies and how they're used to scare people. And I looked up, just out of interest, the average shot length in a movie is between about 4 and 6 seconds, which
really,
but if you think of like shot reverse shot, they're really short shots.
Very true.
That's difficult to say. So I think horror movies, when I was looking into there seems to be a lot more of a thing now for like your opening shot in a horror movie to be a long take. A couple of examples were, again, It Follows, and another one was Get Out, and they were quite similar because they were both kind of like a suburban area, and it was a long take. You were following one specific character, but it's funny again because It Follows was during the day and Get Out was at night. So obviously It Follows was the you just see this girl, she's running kind of in the street, she's got her heels on, but she's got like, I think she's just got like tiny little shorts or pants or something on, and she's just running about, and she's confused and erratic, and they don't know what's happening, and the camera just kind of follows her all the way as she's running aimlessly up the street, and it just kind of builds this sense of dread, because especially with it being the opening scene, we don't know why she's running, we don't know what she's running from, because we're following her during the whole take. we can't see if there's anything chasing her or anything like that. Get Out as well, it's got the character and he's walking through this kind of neighborhood in the dark, and it's following him as he's just trying to walk home, and then there's a kind of white car pulls up beside him, and then he starts to get freaked out, so he turns and walks away, and we follow him, and then the car goes out of the shot, and then there's one point where the camera's now essentially going backwards and the character's walking towards us, and then you kind of see the white car again appears in the shot, and just as the character turns to look at it, the guy comes out of nowhere, basically. And that was really good. It was such like, it wasn't a jump scare because it didn't feel as cheap as a jump scare, but
I think that's the thing with like a long shot as well, is that you're almost like, because you're so used to, like you say, it's like 4 to 6 seconds with there being a cut, you almost, even if you're not necessarily picking up on the length of the shot, there's almost like an element of you holding your breath as the sort of like shot continues. And like you're saying, with it being a jump scare but not being a jump scare, like with it being the one take, it's like, you know, usually with a jump scare you have like a quick cut or
it's a really
like,
quick edit. Yeah,
exactly. Whereas like, yeah, with that, it's like, it's literally built up for the entire length of the shot, so it just feels earned. So even if the result is the same, you know, it's like basically like a loud noise and sudden like appearance and you jump, the movie has built to it so effectively, rather than it just being like out of nowhere and then the movie just continues on.
I think as well, one example, like my absolute, just to go off on a slight tangent about jump scares, my absolute favorite jump scare of all time is from TV. Actually, it was from The Haunting of Hill House, and that does it so well because there's no jump scares the whole way through, and it's just episode after episode after episode, it's just building this kind of horrible tension and dread, and then the jump scare happens, and I kid you not, I almost fell off my chair. It was the scariest thing ever. And had the show been full of jump scares, it wouldn't have been as scary. But because it kind of like lured you almost into this false sense of security. You knew it was going to be scary, but you weren't expecting these jumps, which I think long takes in general kind of do that. Like you're saying, the longer you watch, it's weird, the longer you watch, you think you would get more calm, but you actually get more uneasy. That's maybe just convention wise, because you know it's a horror, you know it's going to be scary.
Well, I guess you know that if there's a take and it's still going, you know that they're building to something, even if you don't know what it is. Like in any film, if there's a long take, then there's a reason for it being a long take, and they're not just gonna, like, the longer it goes on, you're like, okay, well, they're not just gonna cut on something like minute, something like disposable. They're gonna cut on like something big. So you suddenly are, you're like, okay, well, where's the cut coming and why? Why is it gonna cut?
No, that moves us nicely into our next topic, which is a kind of like the idea of subverting horror movie tropes. So yeah, Sam, you're going to take the lead on this one.
Thank you. Back to rambling then. Well, considering we were just talking about it, I've only got like 3 main examples for this one, but like one of the ones I wanted to talk about was Get Out, because I think it does a very good job of subverting like quite a few horror tropes. But like, obviously the really obvious one is, you know, typically within horror films, if a black character exists, they're basically there for like diversity, and then they're the first one to get killed off. Like that is just been the function, unfortunately, for like most of the duration of the genre. You know, typically you have, like, by the end of the movie, you have the final girl, you know, with the young, you know, the attractive, like, young sort of like innocent female, like white female,
like the virginal female.
Yeah, exactly. And Get Out, you like have that turned on its head, where obviously like you have a male black protagonist, and then the villain is obviously like the young, sort of almost innocent seeming, like like nice friendly female, like white female. So I think that does a really good job of just like the whole idea of the movie basically being like a huge like genre subversion or trope subversion. And then another like standout example, which still like blows my mind that this was not like always the plan for the end of the movie. But the end of the movie, obviously the horror movies typically end on like a scare, or like a, you know, the monster returns, or like it ends on like a downbeat note, it ends on like a scary note, like a oh, you thought they were out of the woods, but actually not.
It always
sort
feels
of-
like horror movies are like gearing up for a sequel. Like it's always like they're always just leaving their options open. Like, oh,
yeah,
maybe
very
they'll
true.
come back.
Always, yeah, always sequel bait, isn't there, at the end of a horror
Yeah.
movie? That is what it feels like. But yeah, obviously, Get Out, you have like, you know, it seems like Rose has been defeated. It seems like everything's like the house is burned down, everything's over, and then obviously the cop car pulls up, and that's so well done, that moment, because like I think, as Jordan Peele's talked a lot about, is the fact that like there's nothing like, you know, in most of the horror movies, if a cop car pulls up, you're like, yeah, you're saved.
Yeah.
But within that movie, and it's not just, obviously there is like the real world element that you know you're aware, so like socially, politically, like what that entails, but obviously the movie does also have a scene earlier on where like he is like accosted by a cop and he is like sort of like mistreated, so the movie does like also plant that in your head, but again, really effectively. And then it turns out that it's his friend, and there actually is like a positive ending. And again, I thought that was a really cool way of like flipping things on his head, and it's just like such a really like well done moment, where you genuinely, you're like,
it's such a good example, because there's like such like a soul crushing moment when the car pulls up and you see the flashing lights and you're like, no, not after everything that he's been through.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, then for there to actually be like a positive payoff, and then at that point, like it really does feel like, okay, the movie has earned like a happy ending. I mean, it's not technically a happy ending. Like, the guy went through a lot.
Yeah, he's gonna have some trauma.
Yeah, exactly. There's breakups.
He's gonna have commitment issues after this.
Yeah, definitely. You're not meeting anyone's parents. But yes, yeah. It was the first sort of big example I wanted to talk about. Other one, which you could argue isn't technically horror, but there is like, you know, there's scary moments and stuff in it, I think. But overall, it probably is more of a comedy. Is Cabin in the Woods, which literally just exists to subvert the tropes. In fact, it spells them out for you. Obviously, it mentions there being like, you know, the virgin, the jock, and etc. And I think it does a really good job of having all these like, just poking fun basically at the genre and all the things that it's done over and over and over again, and just like really like having its fun with it, having its cake and eating it, but also manages to have some like sort of suspensefulness in there as well. So like Cabin in the Woods, literally the entire film.
That's so funny as well, because did they not like have to dumb down like the blonde in the movie, like they put something in her hair dye or something that like dumbed her down? That's and so funny.
Pheromones and stuff like that as well to make them hornier.
And
they have the characters then talking about the fact that they're acting out of character and they're acting like they're playing up their stereotypes and stuff like that. That's a very good point. Like, it is, I think, what is it, the stoner's the only one that basically like survives all the tricks because apparently his weed makes him immune or something like that.
That's amazing. Like his little like his coffee cup bong, his coffee
cup exactly. Oh dear. What a brilliant character and brilliant film. But my last sort of like main example that I wanted to talk about, and is one that again I really could have mentioned for like most other of these categories, but kind of wanted to sit on for a bit because like I love it so much. But is Alien. And obviously when that movie released, obviously we're talking about like the final girl being like the young sort of like naive, like attractive female. When Alien was released, it wasn't really like common for there to be like, you know, women-led horror films, especially not like women-led like sci-fi films. So, and Sigourney Weaver, who played Ripley, wasn't even like top billing. Is it Tom Skerritt that is in? It's like he basically, I can't remember what the actor was called. It might be Tom Skerritt, that might be someone else entirely. But basically, there were actors who were paid more for obviously smaller roles in the film, but they were like, which is terrible. You know, there's no way that should have happened. As you know, perfect example of the inequality of the time. But I guess one advantage of that, if you were like a moviegoer and you were like clued in on those things and you paid attention to that sort of thing, you know, who was actually like on the payroll, or at least in like poster wise, I imagine, you know, who was getting like billed first, etc. To obviously have Sigourney be like further in that list, you would never peg her as like the survivor. And not only is she obviously like the last one standing, but she's like constantly portrayed as like the sort of sensible one, the level-headed one, calmest one. Like she takes to the dangers so well, and she is like there's a reason she is like a proper like archetype of like a strong female character. But yeah, she totally like blew the doors off basically the whole and like the best way ever. So yeah, that's my last.
She's a good character as well, because she's not that kind of like, I think sometimes with movies that maybe aren't as well done, the kind of strong female character is just very annoying. And that's weird to say as a woman. Obviously you would want strong female characters, and you do, but you don't want, like, because there's the other character in Alien, the other woman, she's like every annoying female character, which is fair enough. It's a stressful situation. I don't think I'd be acting like Scorny.
Same with you.
So no, that's a great choice. Alien's an amazing movie as well. But no, those were really interesting choices. I think the only one I was going to mention, and it's a very obvious one, is Midsummer, but we've spoken about that before. So
yeah, fair.
I think obviously it's interesting you were talking about Alien, but I think a lot of, obviously we've talked before on a video essay on this channel about the kind of like re-emergence of horror and how it's kind of coming back and how it's becoming more of a thing now. There was a stage in the middle where it was just kind of terrible. And I think a lot of that is to do with that kind of like subversion of tropes. I don't know whether if maybe we've just been like, we're just tired of like slasher movies or terrible ghost movies. I certainly am tired of terrible ghost movies, but yeah, no, I thought it was interesting. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I feel like this could be talked about for an entire podcast, but we'll just do a small section, is performance in horror movies. So I think I keep saying with every topic we come across, I keep saying, oh, I think horror more than most, but horror is one of those ones where it's, especially with the villain, it's so, the whole movie's so like the success of the movie, not financially, but like people enjoying it, it hinges on the villain and how scary the villain is, how kind of sometimes like outrageous and stuff like that. So I think the obvious choice for this one has got to be Hannibal Lecter. Silence of the Lambs, which is hilarious because I think he's only in it for like 10 minutes or something, 12 minutes, something like that. And when you think of Silence of the Lambs, you maybe don't necessarily think of Clarice first. You would think of Hannibal Lecter. And I think what's really scary about him, obviously Anthony Hopkins' performance is amazing, and I think it's because he's so, obviously it's based on a book, so yeah, you know, Thomas Harris, I think that's his name, he has to get some credit, I suppose. But Hannibal's so like, he's very polite and courteous at times, and he's nice to Clarice, and he like, it's weird to say does it a favor, but he does it a favor and gets rid of Mix. So I think that makes it even more jarring, especially because before we even meet him, we get this whole monologue from Dr. Chilton about how he's a monster, and look at this picture of this nurse, he ripped off her face and ate her nose and stuff like that. He's done all of these horrible things, and then you meet him and he's standing in his cell and he's like, oh hello, have a seat, you know. So I think that's really, he's like a perfect horror movie villain in my eyes. And then I wanted to kind of talk about, I think obviously I'm saying that the villain's the most important, but I think the protagonist as well is, I don't know who you would say was more important in a horror movie. What would you say, the villain or the antagonist, the villain or the protagonist?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one to answer, to be fair, because they do so much in different ways. Like you don't, I guess, arguably the protagonist gets a lot more screen time. So in theory, you could probably get away with like a weaker protagonist, because you then have like longer to kind of like build them up. You don't, whereas the villain, has like you're saying with Hannibal Lecter, has like so little like screen time that they need to really bring everything to like their small moments. So I would maybe push that the villain is like, but then again, if you are watching the protagonist for longer, then it would totally ruin the film if they weren't good. So
especially if you think about like obviously Florence Pugh in Midsummer, and I always like think about the mum, the woman who played the mum in the Babadook. She was great.
Yes.
And
So
I think
good.
without her it wouldn't have been the same.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, because that's funny, because if I was thinking like images that pop into my head when I think of the Babadook, it would be it would be her that I would think about, and then the Babadook.
Same, actually.
I think a really interesting example is the movie Us as well, because she kind of plays both the protagonist and the antagonist, and she does them so well. Like, they're two completely different characters, each of them equally as believable. And I think like we were talking about tropes and conventions and things in horror movies, we're conditioned, and much as you might like them, you don't like. I like Hannibal Lecter as a character, but I don't encourage cannibalism or murder or anything like that. Do you know what I mean? So we're kind of conditioned to want the bad guy to lose. And I think in Us it's really interesting because she does such a good job when she's Adelaide. We really, really root for her, and then when the kind of reveal comes at the end, you're just left like reeling, because who are you meant to be rooting for here?
Exactly. Yeah, it does such a good job of like solidifying the point it's making, like with that review, while also like it just being a great review. And yeah, like you say, like Lupita Nyong'o, I don't think can get enough credit for that role, because like it is unbelievable the performance she puts in. And again, to literally be like acting opposite yourself, and trying to get like sympathy from an audience at the same time, also terrifying them, is just something else entirely. Like, it's probably the most you can really ask from like an actor or actress, and she crushes it because she's so memorable.
Have you ever seen like any like behind the scenes stuff? She like stays in character as, I think her character is called Red, and she like stays in character when they've cut and things like that. So there's one point where everyone's just having a wee chat, and she's just kind of sitting in the corner, and she's doing that kind of weird thing when she's just sitting staring, and it was eerie. Like, it was really, really creepy.
I would not have. Don't know how much I've enjoyed being around that set.
Yeah, can you imagine being like the poor first AD or something, be like, guys, it's lunchtime, and for her to just be sitting staring at you and be like, lunchtime.
Yeah, you probably bring her the food. You don't really want to take her to catering.
Just bring her a nice rabbit or something. She'll enjoy that. Another thing I wanted to talk about was this, and I think this is mainly born from like old kind of like zombie movies, is this like this kind of slow, unending kind of like walk that some horror villains have, which is somehow sometimes creepier than if they were just running at you. And I think obviously it does come from the kind of zombie thing where they're dead, so they're not going to stop. They're just, you need to stop and rest, and you know that, and you need to stop and eat, and they're just going to keep coming and coming and coming. And there's like this idea of there not being any kind of respite or rest from them is obviously like, it's really draining. And then once you're drained, it starts to build this kind of fear. I think that's a really good example. Obviously my two examples of this are movies I've already spoken about at length, which is Halloween and It Follows, if you can believe it.
No, quite right.
And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was, obviously we've spoken about the kind of way that characters move. Even like Hannibal Lecter, the way that he kind of holds himself and he stands is like, because he's so polite and like well-mannered, it's just creepy. But there's nothing creepier in a horror movie than someone crawling down the stairs. And they like doing that in horror movies. In The Exorcist, obviously a famous example, The Ring, which we've spoken about before. And I think this is so funny because I don't know whether it's just me, but do you know how sometimes like if you're maybe running up the stairs and someone's behind you running up the stairs, you just instantly panic?
Yeah.
So that like
the stairs.
Yeah. So the thought of something coming crawling down the stairs is just horrifying beyond belief.
Absolutely.
And I think that's that thing again where it's like we were talking about distorted faces, it kind of, you can, especially with like The Ring and The Exorcist, is like possessed people, so it looks like people, but it's not moving the way that normal people move.
Yeah, it's a very good point actually. Like the performance aspect is so important there, where like those movies make a point of showing you that these are not the people that like they should be. These are not behaving like people. Exorcist movies in general, like anyone you watch, they'll always like make a point of just the way that like character will walk or move, and
or even just like if they're like lying in a bed, just the way they like move their heads and their arms and stuff is always you can tell just by watching them they're possessed by something.
yeah, exactly. Not going anywhere near that.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, I thought I didn't. Those were my two examples of that, because I don't think you need to mention any others once you've spoken about that.
Exactly. Yeah, that is very much the ceiling on them. It's not been done better, and I think they did it at a point when it was a much fresher thing to do. But it's handled very well. So yeah, I like your picks.
Sorry, just quickly, even just thinking about, like, I wonder if there's any kind of element, because everyone has fallen down the stairs in their life. I wonder if like, I wouldn't be able to do that without tumbling to my death. I wonder if that's what makes it scary as well. Like,
it's true. It's almost like this thing is better than you.
Like they're not scared. They have no fear of stairs. They're just gonna come charging down regardless.
Yeah, there's no clumsiness there. Like it's clearly an apex predator we're dealing with.
Exactly. I don't want it anywhere near that.
No, very, very good points. I think for performance, the one I'm always kind of drawn to, like the first one that kind of like dings into my head. Again, spoke about this movie so many times, including within this episode of this podcast. But Toni Collette in Hereditary is just like one of the best performances in anything ever. Like, again, she brings so much to that role when you like really, really buy into like her grief. And yeah, again, I guess like you say, it's a character that could very easily probably be annoying on paper. Like she's just like constantly distraught and distressed, but the movie's just like so bleak and has such a bleak feel. And she really like grounds the performance and still manages to make herself like endearing as she's like just like going completely over the edge. And she just like you really, really buy into that character so much. And she like performs at every like ounce of her acting talent, basically.
Yeah, she is. I feel that's one of those things where like you almost feel bad for the other people in the movie, because they are also very good, but compared to her, I'm like, you guys should just go home.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You might as well just take lunch now, guys. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. No, she is amazing in that. She's amazing in most things, but that in particular. Yes, very good choice.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, I think we'll wrap that up there. I think obviously there's different elements that we haven't spoken about that we could have, like editing, different things like that. But those were just a couple that I wanted to talk about, things that I found interesting. And I hope that we're interesting. It's always hard to tell if people aren't like filmy people the way that you and I are, whether these things are interesting or not. But I hope it was.
It's a very good I had a blast like researching it, and a blast talking about it, because again, it's just like, I feel like horror is the perfect genre to talk about like the various aspects of, because it is so experimental. People push it further, and there's usually not a lot of budgets, not a lot of a budget, but like a lot done with it. And that just like, again, just like the ways that like people use simple like filming techniques to try and like make you scared. It's a very interesting thing. So
that's definitely one of my favorite things about horror movies, is that you as a rational human being know that everything that you're seeing is fake, and that it's, especially if you've studied film, you know how they've done it most of the time. Like you've seen the setup, you know that it's just lights and a camera and some actors and a set, but it's still scary. And I always think that's really interesting. Like it kind of like bypasses your common sense almost.
Yeah, exactly. You know that you're secure. I guess as we mentioned the Jaws, you know that you're on dry land. You know that you're like in no immediate danger, and yet your body still reacts as if you are.
Yep. And even after the movie's finished, like if you're lying in bed at night and it's dark and you freak yourself out because of a movie, I just think that's so interesting.
Exactly, and I think again, like all the techniques that we've talked about, really lend themselves to that paranoia that follows like watching a horror movie, because I guess like what we talked about with like framing, composition, and even like sound, the subtlety of like what's used a lot of the time is what makes you, any noise that you hear in the dark, suddenly you're like, what's that?
Yeah.
And the fact that they use like familiar elements within like the sound design, lighting design, and so many horrors are obviously just set in like, you know, people's houses or like streets or whatever. It does very much make you like buy into the threats of whatever you're watching, in like the most brilliant way.
Yeah, I think as well, you're talking about subtlety. That's one of those things that where you maybe don't pick up on it while you're watching, but when you're going through it in your head, that's when you're like, oh yeah, remember like the mirror thing. Oh yeah, remember every time he was talking to a ghost, he was seeing a mirror, and then you start to pick up other kind of scary things like that. So it's the gift that keeps on giving. Our horror movies, good horror movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's plenty of terrible ones out there, but we won't discuss them. That's for another time potentially.
That definitely is for another time.
Yeah. But no, Sam, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I liked all your choices. Very good choices.
Thank you. I like the whole like subject, and I very much enjoyed your choices as well. Like it's as usual, like there's a bit of overlap, but in the best way.
Yeah, no, definitely. But no, thank you very much. And we'll be back in 2 weeks. And Sam, so it'll be your turn to host. So that'll be interesting. Pleasant to see what you do. So yeah, in the meantime, thank you. And we'll see you later. Bye.